FBI would like to talk to because we believe they may have information that could be helpful to the investigation.
Another FBI list, this one made public. The 19 men who the FBI says were the hijackers of the 4 aircraft. 7 of the men were pilots, according to CNN terrorism analyst Peter Bergen. 13 of them have recognizable Saudi tribal names from the west and southwest of Saudi Arabia, an area where bin Laden has recruited.
According to a source familiar with the bin Laden organization, men returning from Afghanistan who had trained with bin Laden arrived in Saudi Arabia in recent weeks and were talking about some kind of big operation that was imminent.
The FBI searched this apartment in San Diego, where in those final stages, Monday before the attack, 3 men left town in a hurry.
They had the truck right here, they was moving out. Did that seem like you were leaving anywhere? I mean, I never seen nobody move at midnight.
The trail of another accused hijacker, Mohammed Atta, in the months before the attack, led from Hamburg, Germany, to Florida and a series of flight schools, rental car agencies, and apartments. Then back to Hamburg, a return to Florida, and a final trip to New England, where he boarded a Boston to Los Angeles flight that eventually crashed into the World Trade Center. U.S. intelligence sources tell CNN the entire terrorist operation required so many people and special skills that they believe several terrorist groups had to be involved. Egyptian Islamic Jihad, led by this man, Ayman Zawahiri, a close bin Laden associate, is one of the groups getting close scrutiny by U.S. analysts. They were photographed together about 3 years ago in Afghanistan. A second man who has not been seen in more than 20 years is also being scrutinized. Imad Mughniya, who is suspected by U.S. officials of masterminding a string of terrorism attacks against Americans, including the 1983 suicide bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut that killed 241, has had numerous contacts with bin Laden since 1994, including face-to-face contact in the Sudan at an Islamic conference. This, according to Western and Mideast intelligence sources. A founding member of Lebanese Hezbollah, Mughniya is believed living in Iran. U.S. officials remain convinced that bin Laden was behind Tuesday's attack, but believe the day's mega-terrorism marked the debut of a new, larger, and more dangerous organization, a group with many heads and many faces. Mike Betcher, CNN, Atlanta.
Consider this for a moment. CNN has learned something about a brief encounter before one of the hijacked flights on Tuesday, a brief encounter that in our new world, the world post-Tuesday, might have raised a very large red flag. When Flight 77 at Dulles Airport was about to board Tuesday morning, an American Airlines employee was chatting with a couple of Arab men who appeared to be friends. One was holding a first-class boarding pass. His friend scheduled to fly in coach. This plane had many empty seats, so the American Airlines employee asked, "Why don't you guys sit together?" The 2 men said nothing. She felt that was odd. Those 2 men are on the FBI's list of the 19 suspected hijackers. About 2 hours after that brief encounter, Flight 77 smashed into the Pentagon. CNN has been piecing together what happened aboard each of those 4 hijacked flights. Been working on this all week, and you can see what we've learned tomorrow morning with Miles O'Brien, 8 o'clock in the morning Eastern Time. As many of you know and many of you watched, there was a prayer service at the National Cathedral in Washington. The entire Washington establishment was there. Much of the diplomatic corps from around the world was there as well. Afterward, the president headed to New York City, as we mentioned at the beginning of the program, and went to that area that used to be the World Trade Center, keeping track of the president, as he always does for us, our senior White House correspondent, John King.
Well, good evening to you, Aaron. Certainly a very emotional day for the president, perhaps a significant one as well. We know, as you mentioned, the president up in New York to give a pep rally to those relief workers, that just following an effort to console the nation through that national prayer service. And as all that took place on a busy day for the president, a significant development, could be hugely significant, as the administration's deliberations now turn increasingly to both immediate and long-term military options.
A first-hand look at the worst of the devastation and a pep talk that included a promise to those pulling the dead from the rubble.
I can hear you. I I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
After his emotional tour of New York, Mr. Bush was asked if he knew who was responsible.
We know we got a suspect.
But lead suspect Osama bin Laden is an elusive target, and aides say one of the president's greatest challenges is convincing an angry nation to be patient.
This conflict was begun on the timing and terms of others. It will end in a way and at an hour of our choosing.
Mr. Bush declared a national emergency and authorized a call-up of the National Guard and reservists. And Congress unanimously passed a resolution authorizing the president to use all necessary and appropriate force to retaliate. Senior officials say they do not rule out a first wave of military strikes in the near future. But Mr. Bush is asking his national security team and other world leaders to develop a long-range plan. For example, sources tell CNN the president is asking the leaders of Canada, France, Germany, Britain, and other nations to do more to break up terrorist cells in their countries, and asking Saudi Arabia and other moderate Arab nations to crack down on bin Laden's financial supporters and to take a tougher line with the Taliban in Afghanistan.
In our response, we will have to take into account not only the perpetrators, but those who provide haven, support, inspiration, financial, and other assets to the perpetrators.
Mr. Bush also led the nation in a day of prayer and remembrance, with former presidents, the cabinet, and the Congress joining in.
Grief and tragedy and hatred are only for a time. Goodness, remembrance, and love have no end. And the Lord of life holds all who die and all who mourn.
Consoling the nation is another role for a president at times of crisis, and a father who knows the strains of the job well gave his son a supportive tap. Now, senior officials telling us tonight that the weekend national security deliberations will increasingly focus on those military options, and sources telling CNN tonight they enter those discussions with one very positive development in their view. Pakistan today, and Pakistan borders Afghanistan, promised to fully cooperate with any U.S. operations, including, we are told, giving U.S. warplanes permission to use Pakistani airspace if necessary. Aaron?
That was a very sweet moment. The two President Bushes, father and son, are very sensitive about the relationship and all of that. And when he grabs his hand and squeezes it, that was lovely, wasn't it?
It certainly was. A very close relationship between these two men. This president, very sensitive because of the criticism when he was campaigning for president about how much he relies on his father for advice. The White House has put those conversations off limits, but they have conceded among the first people President Bush, the 43rd, called was his father for advice in this crisis.
Have we heard anything from the president at all about his reaction to his tour of Ground Zero, if you will?
We are told he told senior aides when he got back to the helicopter that he was quite emotional about it, that he was struck by it, struck most of all, he said, by the anger. As he shook hands along the rope line, the president trying to cheer people up, they in turn were telling him how mad they were. That is what the president told reporters and his senior staffers. And we also know quite an emotional moment for the president, Aaron, not captured on videotape, but as the president was meeting with families, one woman in New York gave him a police badge. Her son was a Port Authority police officer killed in the devastation.
And the weekend for the president is where? The White House or somewhere else?
The president is not at the White House this weekend. He is away. He will meet with his national security team. We're being careful, Aaron. We should be clear to our viewers about disclosing what we know about the president's location because of what we are told by the administration are continuing threats. So we're going to try to be responsible. When the president is out in public, we will show him out in public. When he's not out in public, we might know where he is. We might not disclose that. We know he is having serious conversations with his national security team over the weekend. We will be covering those as the weekend progresses.
John, thank you. I didn't mean to put you in an awkward situation there. I hope
not
I
at
did
all.
not.
Not at all.
Thank you. I appreciate your candor on that. Thank you very much.
No.
Good work this week, too, as always. This seems like the right time, at least. We're starting to talk about how the government might respond to what has gone on. This is a very complicated problem, and there are a number of facets to it tonight. So we'll go to CNN's Jamie McIntyre over at the Pentagon. There's first, before we get into military response, there is some news tonight out of there we ought to report on first. Jamie, go ahead.
Well, a couple of things, Aaron. First of all, the death toll has been slightly revised from 190 to 189 unaccounted for and believed dead. That's because it turns out that one person, a Department of Defense worker who was missing, turned out to have been a passenger on the plane, American Airlines Flight 77, and was therefore counted twice. The old number was 190, now it's 189, but Pentagon officials say that's still a preliminary number. It could change. On another front, Pentagon sources tell CNN that at least 4 U.S. fighter jets were scrambled in an attempt to intercept the hijacked jetliners on Tuesday, but none of the planes arrived in time to take any action. In the case of the first plane, the World Trade Center, Pentagon officials say that 2 armed F-15s took off about 8:52 a.m. from Otis Air National Guard Base in Massachusetts. It was about 6 minutes after the first plane crashed into the tower. As the planes raced toward New York, they did not arrive until after the second jetliner crashed into the second tower, so there really wasn't much they could do. Air Force officials say that there wasn't really any discussion about the possibility of shooting down those planes because they didn't really arrive in time to do that. Now, in the case of the Pentagon, again, Air Force fighter jets were scrambled, this time out of Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. 2 F-16s took off about 9:35 in the morning. According to the FAA, that plane crashed into the Pentagon about 9:39, so it was 3 or 4 minutes before the incident took place that the planes took off, but they were more than 100 miles away. Now, the Pentagon says that it would take a presidential order for an American fighter jet to shoot down a civilian airliner, but on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer tonight, Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz said that that might have happened if it was you were able to determine that the plane was not under the control of the legitimate pilot and was about to cause massive damage. But in both of these cases, the planes never got a chance to get close enough to even consider that.
Coin, what seems like a lifetime ago, back to Tuesday, we were talking at some point Tuesday about what flight controllers, the FAA, must have known, that they had planes that had veered wildly off course, nowhere near where they were supposed to be, and what happened after that. There's going to be a lot of texture to this, a lot of reporting still to be done on who knew what, when, how these orders went out, and ultimately, I suppose, what people were thinking was going on up there.
Well, here's what, they knew they had hijacked planes because they had reports of that, partly from the cell phone conversations and other data. So they knew planes were hijacked. They knew in some cases they had disappeared off the radar screen. But you know, if you're a fighter pilot and you go up and let's say you were to observe the plane approaching the Pentagon, there are some places where you could shoot down a jetliner like that and it would go into the ground and not that many people might get hurt on the ground, but this is a busy metropolitan area. Even if you were to have gotten there in time and you were able to determine that the plane was heading for the Pentagon and the pilot was able to get authorization, which would have had to come from the president, to shoot the plane down, there's no guarantee it might not have killed even more people on the ground than it did in this case, 189, if it hit some other busy area. For instance, the Navy Annex right up the hill from the Pentagon, or the busy shopping area, the Pentagon. There's a Pentagon City area and a Crystal City area that are just dense with buildings. It could have been even more tragic. So if the pilot had been able to get there in time, he would have had a heck of a decision to have to make.
Well, that's the other part of this, isn't it? I mean, it is, and I'm not sure there's a question here as much as there is just a kind of thought that imagine both the pilot, the commanders, or his bosses, if you will, the people who would have had to make a decision to shoot down a commercial airline plane, a lot of Americans on board, shoot it out of the sky. I mean, it's almost as unthinkable as the ultimate outcome here.
Well, there is sort of a procedure for that. It would have involved the fighter plane would have had to come up alongside the plane. It would have tried to establish contact with the pilot, ask what his intentions were. He's not on his regular flight path. Might have tried to signal the plane. Then he would have had the radio for authorization. All of that would have taken time, and there wasn't that much time to react in this case. And even then, it would have been an agonizing decision that, again, only President Bush could have made for a U.S. military jet to shoot down a commercial jetliner with innocent civilians on board.